Hello, my name's Wesley Everman. I'm the Extension Weed Specialist and Assistant Professor in Weed Science at Iowa State University. Today, I'm going to talk to you about tools and tactics to manage water hemp. But first off, I want to give a little bit of a background just so you guys could get to know me, who I am, where I've been, what makes me qualified to be talking about this. So, I grew up in Northeast Iowa, native to Iowa, up near Decorah, up in the Driftless region. Uh, Went to undergrad at Purdue University, majored in agronomic business and marketing, and found out through a series of internships I could get paid to kill plants. I wasn't that great of an agronomist, it turned out. I did better killing plants than I did growing them. So I said, heck yeah, I'll go on to get a graduate degree, master's in weed science. It was in remote sensing, classification of images, 20 some years ago before it was cool and we didn't have all the little drones. From there, I realized I still enjoyed weed science and wanted to pursue a little bit more education in it. Went on to NC State University down in North Carolina. I did a lot of weed biology, ecology type work, some physiology, a whole breadth of different research projects. So, got a lot of different experience there, a few different systems, and from there, my professional career started with my first faculty position at Michigan State University from 2008 to 2011. I worked in corn, potatoes, and forages there, and then had the opportunity to go back to North Carolina State in 2011, where I was the weed specialist, extension specialist for corn, soybeans, small grains. I did some bioenergy crops. And then I also did a little bit of work in cotton, some sweet potatoes, tobacco, stuff like that, peanuts as well. I was there until 2024 and then had the opportunity to come on back to the Midwest, come back home, and started at Iowa State here November 1st. So, as of this recording, I'm just a little over 2 months on the job, learning a lot. Even though we've got 4 inches of snow the last couple days, it's great to be back home and great to be in Iowa. And I look forward to working with everybody on our challenges going forward. My current position, I'm 55% extension, 25% research, 15% teaching, and 5% service. So I have each of the components of the land grant model, the mission, using extension to deliver the message from the research that I do, and also teaching the students, as we come back to the farm, all the tactics and the base that we need to be successful. My primary responsibility is in weed management and corn and soybeans. Like I said, I've worked in a number of other crops, so I'm open to helping out, in other areas, some minor crops in the state where I might be needed. And you can see I also will be teaching the undergraduate weed science course, Agronomy 3170. My philosophy, just, for you folks that are new to getting to know me, for me, growers are the backbone of the land grant mission. Honest to God, I see my interaction with growers as critical in understanding what research needs there are, what I need to work on, and where my focus should be. So, all of my components, research, teaching, and extension, are with the grower needs in mind. I have a hands on interactive approach in how I do my research, how I do my extension. I really enjoy grower meetings, going to field days, and traditional methods, getting out into the field, talking about what needs to be done on the field edge, not just sitting on campus. And, I realize there's an increasing interest in digital resources. And so I do have an X handle. I plan to put out different fact sheets and have digital resources, videos, and whatnot that will extend our research and give growers the opportunity to learn on different platforms. So, with that behind us, what's with these weeds, right? What's going on? What's happening? And right, I'm 2 months on the job. I don't have a bunch of research to show you guys, but there is a lot of research that's been done at Iowa State. And a lot of this stuff goes across species. These are things that we can address with some knowledge, looking back at what's been done in the past, what are we doing now that's of concern, and what can we do in the future to manage these weeds? So, we're going to look at our different herbicide groups that we're relying on, the resistance we're seeing in key species, what we're going to do for management, how we're going to diversify what we do to battle these weeds, and really kind of look at a whole system, what we're going to do going forward. Okay. Now, when I show this slide at an extension talk, I usually wait for the audience to respond with their best guess on what was the first resistant weed we had in Iowa. Now, so far, I haven't had folks guess it correctly, and in fact, I was surprised myself that it was kochia in 1985, resistant to the trizenes. Now, it's not been a major weed for us in Iowa through the years, but we should be aware it is a big challenge for folks to the west of us. The next few years, we saw more trizene resistance in common lamb's quarters, Pennsylvania smartweed, and giant foxtail. And when we look at the trends over time, right? This is a slide from weedscience.org where it's a composite of resistant biotypes across the country, around the world, and even state by state. This is just looking at the number of resistant species for each site of action. You can see them listed out by color. I'll draw your focus here to the trizenes, right? You see this spike in the mid 80s with more resistant species to the trizenes. Why did this happen? Well, we used a lot of atrazine, a lot of other trizenes in the 60s, definitely through the 70s and the 80s. We had heavy reliance on them and we used them in a lot of our crops. So it stands to reason, yep, we're going to have a spike in resistance after repeated exposure, right? Now, back to our list, water hemp was our next resistant weed. It first showed up as resistant to ALS inhibitors in 1993. Now, back to this chart. Well, we used the trizenes really heavily in the 70s and 80s. We started seeing resistance, right? The more widespread resistance to that family. And what came along in the 80s and was used a lot in our corn and soybeans? If you guess the ALS inhibitors, you're right. And we started to see this spike in resistance in the mid 90s, again, due to the heavy use in the 80s. You see this trend starting to form here. History repeats itself. I'm a big fan of studying history and seeing what we can learn from it. Next resistant biotype was giant foxtail to the ACCase inhibitors, our grass herbicides in 1994. And you'll notice here, this is the first time we have the same weed show up twice. Giant foxtail for the trizenes and the ACCase inhibitors. Now, since then, foxtail hasn't been a major issue, but around the country, we've been seeing more resistance in our grass species, especially to glyphosate, starting to show up. Not saying it's happening here, but if we look at what's happening in trends, we need to be watching what's happening with our grasses here. Just just something to think about. And again, our ACCase inhibitors, we see this resistance show up in the mid 90s, mid to late 90s. Now, you'll notice that green line doesn't spike up like the others. These herbicides only work on grasses, they're not working on broadleaves. So you only have about half of the species that you can get resistance to, or probably even less than half if we're being honest. There's a lot more broadleaves and grasses in most of our fields. So this one will never really get the same spike, but you see that increase in resistance again after repeated use through about 10 to 15 years. All right, looking at the rest of the 90s, we got some ALS inhibitor resistance in cocklebur, sunflower, and sugarcane. Water hemp shows up as resistant in 1996 to the trizenes. Again, water hemp showing up resistant to two different groups of herbicides at this point. Moving into the 2000s, we see ALS resistant giant ragweed show up. Then water hemp in 2009, resistant to PPO inhibitors and glyphosate. Okay, separate biotypes, but we're seeing resistant to two different herbicide groups. This brings us to the glyphosate, the glycines. Again, We started using these in the mid to late 90s, heavily in our soybeans and then our corn in the 2000s, right? And we started to see that spike after about 10 to 15 years of use. This is a common thread with each of these herbicide groups where we see the most resistant biotypes worldwide. So, what else is happening? Okay. Giant ragweed resistant to glyphosate also in 2009. Then our first stacked resistance in water hemp shows up. We have a three-way resistant biotype to ALS, trizenes, and AHPPD. This is where our concerns are new, fresh, and probably greater than individual resistance. And we'll talk about this a little bit later. Then 2011, we saw glyphosate resistant horseweed and four-way resistant water hemp. Now we tacked on the glyphosate to that three-way resistance. 2021, dicamba resistance was identified in Iowa. 2022, Palmer amaranth showed up resistant to four different herbicide groups. And on a side note, personally, I was glad that there was Palmer here and water and resistance before I showed up. I mean, I didn't bring it. You can't accuse me of it. It didn't come from North Carolina. So anyway, we have Palmer amaranth. It's on small acres. It's something we need to keep an eye on, but it's not a widespread problem. Water hemp in 2024, it's not officially confirmed, but there is a small population in an isolated area where it is surviving 2,4-D, and all signs point to this being confirmed as 2,4-D resistant in the near future. So, what we see here is a number of different resistant biotypes, especially in our water hemp. And what I wanted to do is give a visual, right? All right, great, a list. What does that mean? Well, when we look at the efficacy table from WC94, this is our soybean herbicides. So, for example, if we looked at trying to control water hemp there in the red box, what are we going to use? You look at that first line, that's our ACCase inhibitors, our grass herbicides. And you can see they don't control any broadleaves. They never have, they never will. Okay. So we're not trying to use those to kill water hemp. The next line is Basagran, Benazon. Hopefully nobody's using Basagran to control their pigweeds, especially water hemp. If you are, give me a call. We'll keep it quiet. No worries. But for all intents and purposes, those have never really worked, so we black those out. Then let's say we take out glyphosate resistance. Okay, so we can't use glyphosate on a lot of our populations, can't use the PPO inhibitors on a lot of them. ALS inhibitors are all but useless on water hemp in most cases. We do have dicamba resistance, 2,4-D resistance. That leaves Liberty, right? And now, 2,4-D and dicamba aren't widespread issues. I'm not saying we can't use those still, but this is the path we're heading down. And if we only have one herbicide we can use post emergence, everybody's going to be using it. I've heard some folks say this is the best herbicide to use, and a lot of folks are planning to use it. Okay. How many years have we been using a lot of Liberty to kill our water hemp? And how many years do we have left before we see resistance? In some states, Arkansas and North Carolina being two of them, we do have glufosinate resistant Palmer amaranth already existing. Okay. So we know it can happen. It's not confirmed. There's not any suspicious populations out there. But if history taught us anything, we just had a nice history lesson. This is in our future if we're not careful. Now, we can also look at what's been going on in Iowa. So in 2013 and 2019, there were statewide surveys done on different populations of water hemp to see what they're resistant to. Okay. So in 2013, about 90% of the populations were resistant to the ALS inhibitors, herbicide group 2. Roughly 80%, 75, 80% were resistant to herbicide group 5, beatrazine. and about the same 75% or so were resistant to glyphosate, herbicide group 9. There was no populations that were identified resistant to the PPO inhibitors, group 14, and about 5 to 10% resistant to the HPPD inhibitors, group 27. Okay, so this paints a pretty good picture for where things were at in 2013. We had widespread ALS, triazine, and glyphosate resistance in our water hemp populations, and a number of those were going to be stacked resistance, right? Now, when we look at 2019, we see roughly 100% of the populations were resistant to both pursuit and glyphosate, rendering them effectively useless for water hemp. Right now, they still work on all our other species. They still have value going out in the field, but for water hemp, we lost efficacy there. Triazines didn't increase in resistance very much, but we're still around 80% of the populations aren't controlled with atrazine. What's concerning is we see an increase in resistance to both PPO inhibitors and the HPPD inhibitors, roughly 15% at this point. So we still can control 85% of the populations with these herbicides, but with repeated use and exposure, that number is going to increase. Through this survey, there were no populations identified resistant to dicamba, 2,4-D, or glufosinate, which is a good thing, meaning we have 3 to 5 effective herbicide groups that we can use in our corn and our soybean. So when we look at the current state of resistance, multiple resistance is becoming a big concern. And this graph, again from weedscience.org, shows the increase in weed populations resistant to multiple modes of action over time. So we go back to the 80s. Most of these populations were resistant to one or two, maybe three modes of action at most. Then, as we get into the 90s and the 2000s, we start to see an increase in 3 and 4, even 5 and 6 way resistance. Most recently, the last few years, we're even starting to see 7 way resistance. And on the right of this slide, you can see some of the species that are of greatest concern. Now, Italian ryegrass, we don't have a big problem with, but you can see water hemp with 5 way resistance, Palmer amaranth with 6 way resistance. And again, annual bluegrass is more in managed turf situations, but we see it as a species where we can have 7 way resistance. Why is this important? When you look at the first three, ryegrass, water hemp, palmer, especially the pigweeds, water hemp and palmer amaranth, they're obligate outcrossers. So you have to hybridize between two plants to get viable offspring. It's not self pollinated like some of our other weeds. So, this gives a lot of genetic diversity. And this is where we have a lot of our challenges, right? Because that genetic diversity allows these weeds to survive in a whole range of conditions. It's not just with herbicides, but it's environmental conditions as well. They can survive drought, they might survive cold, wet conditions, they might compete better in shade. So, this plasticity of the genetics in water hemp really give it a chance to survive and give it an opportunity to overcome whatever Mother Nature or man throws at it. And so, this is why we see water hemp as one of our biggest challenges here in the state. Now, moving on again with stacked resistance, but looking at these screens from 2013 and 2019, on the left, you can see we had 1 way, 2 way, 3 way, and 4 way resistance in 2013, with the majority being 2 or 3 way, right? Roughly 90% were 2 to 3 way resistant. What's concerning, and again, why I'm stressing this multiple resistance being a concern going forward, is when we look to 2019. We had a shift towards more multiple resistance. We didn't even have populations that were 1 way resistant. They all started at 2 way. It's about 20%. So you could say, oh, the 2 way resistance dropped from about 40 to 20. Well, that's not good because it shifted to three, four, and even five-way resistant populations here in the state. When we stack resistance, we lose options. We lose herbicide groups. We lose the ability to diversify our chemical weed control. It reduces our opportunity to make decisions on the farm, right? This is taking away options. It's making the decision for us. We don't want this to shift any further than it currently has. Unfortunately, it probably is. This is 2019. This lines up great for me to do a survey in 2025, and I plan to. It'll be about every 6 years, and we can see where we're at. Hopefully, about this time next year, maybe a little bit later in the season, I'll be able to say, okay, here's where we're going, here's how we're tracking, and we have a better snapshot in time. But this tells us enough to say we're shifting the wrong way, and we're going to have big issues going forward. So what's left? All right, I've already talked about dicamba, 2,4-D, and glufosinate being effective on the majority of the acres. Where we have the dicamba resistance, where that 2,4-D resistance are, they're isolated, small areas, not widespread, not spreading as far as I'm aware. Folks that have these challenges are trying to do a good job stewarding and keeping them from becoming a big issue in the area. Now, I have question marks by the HPPD or PPO. That 2019 survey showed about 20% of the population being resistant to each of those. The question is, in the last 6 years, how much has that increased? As I've been out in the state, as I've been talking to folks, I hear that there's more of a challenge there, that the HBPDs aren't working as well, the PPOs aren't working as well. So where is that landing? Is it 40, 50%? Is it higher? We'll have answers, but I have question marks because I think it's going to go field by field. So as you make a decision on what you're going to spray, you need to know your field history and what's effective. We have over the top dicamba, 2,4-D, glufosinate that we can definitely use. Now, dicamba may not be available for soybeans this year, but definitely in corn, it's still an option. Now, pick and choose, try to use these wisely and combine them where we can. Pre-emergence, we have our group 15s. We rely heavily on those. There are some concerns about resistance. Be investigating some populations soon, that seem to be surviving where group 15s are applied. Neighboring states do have resistance to group 15s in their water hemp. So it's not unrealistic to think we just haven't found it here in Iowa. That's something I'll be trying to get a finger on, get a handle on in the near future as well. You might hear some people talk about Group 12 coming along in the next year or two. We'll see diflufenican as a product that'll be in premixtures, be available. This is one we don't typically use in row crops, and so it will give us an alternative mode of action, and it will be something that we can hopefully use on these resistant populations. And I should have included on this slide PPOs and HPPD inhibitors so far still show good efficacy pre-emergence, even if we have resistance post-emergence. And quickly, not to get too deep into it, a lot of this comes down to the dose and the size of the plant, right? When that plant is emerged, when it's up and we spray it post-emergence, it's got resources, reserves, and often the ability to survive those applications. When you have a seedling that's just emerging through the soil, if we use the full rate and we had good activation, often it doesn't have that ability to overcome and break down that herbicide and survive. So, not saying we won't see resistance to pre emerge applications of PPO inhibitors or HPPD inhibitors, but we do still see efficacy there. So, it's a tool that we can still include, but just be aware resistance is lurking. So what are we going to do? How are we going to manage this resistance and what are we going to do going forward? And one of the biggest things we need to do is minimize the seed bank. Okay? This is something our grandfathers, great grandfathers worried about every year, and it was a focus in weed management, right? The adage 1 year seeding is a lifetime of weeding holds true. A lot of these seeds have a lot of longevity in the soil. They'll be around for years once they get into that soil seed bank. Our goal is to try to reduce that seed bank so we have fewer weeds emerge. We put less selection pressure on our herbicides and reduce the chance of that 1 in a million, 1 in a billion weeds surviving. If you're not trying to control a billion weeds, you're only trying to control 100,000, it'll take a few more years to even see that one resistant plant show up even, right? So minimizing the seed bank is one of the big keys. Control our weed escapes prior to seed set. So in soybeans, it's fairly easy, right? We can see that water hemp or other species sticking up above the canopy later in the season. Usually, just driving down the road, we can pick them out pretty easily. What we want to do is kill those plants, take them out of the field, keep those seed from setting, maturing, and dropping back into the soil. I often say there's one method, one thing that's effective 100% of the time, and I'm not sure if everybody's heard of wraparound, but boy, does it work, right? So what you do is you take your hand, you wrap it around that plant, and you pull it out. 100% effectiveness. You carry it out of the field, don't drop it there. We've seen that with these amaranths, they'll often reroot if you just drop them in the field and there's good moisture. So kill these weeds. We can pull them, we can hoe them. There's weed zappers, there's late season sprays that can be targeted to knock these out because often a resistant plant will just be one plant out in that field and it turns into a bigger problem year on year. So any escapes are something we need to start taking seriously and try to handle it early and not fight it when it becomes a problem. Another thing we need to do, make sure we do not depend on a single herbicide site of action. Okay. We want to use multiple sites of action, multiple herbicide groups within a crop, starting with a pre. I'm a big advocate of using a pre as a setup. You kill a lot of those seedlings, take selection pressure off of those post herbicides that we're losing one by one, right? So having a pre out there is going to definitely help us out. Another thing, use crop rotation, right? It's a good agronomic practice in general, but we can change our sites of action. Now, with GMOs, have a lot of our corn herbicides being used in soybeans, but we can selectively set up our herbicide programs so we use different sites of action in each crop. We also want to use full rates, including sequentials and tank mixes. Here's a good example. This is put together by Megan Anderson. Like I said, I haven't had a opportunity to have a lot of my own stuff in 2 months' time, but there's great resources already put together by folks here at Iowa State, like the surveys that were already done, like this uh, slide here showing how these rates line up. Okay, so you take a premix like Resicor. The rate by the label is 2.75 quarts. That'll give you 1.93 pounds of acetochlor, zero 0.21 pounds of mesotrione. Well, if you were to apply acetochlor on its own, it'd be harness, and the labeled rate for that application would be 2.41 pounds active ingredient. So you can see from that 2.41 to the 1.93, it's about a half a pound less in that premixture. The same is true for mesotrione. If we did Callisto on its own, pre-emergence, we'd be putting out 0.24 pounds AI. So again, it's a slight reduction, but it's still a reduction in that active ingredient. Now, I realize there's a lot of complexities to this and pricing, probably played a role in what rates you could put together and keep that price competitive. That's all fine and dandy, but we need to compare apples to apples when we're making our decisions about controlling our weeds, right? If we're putting out reduced rates, we're giving those weeds an opportunity to survive a lower rate than would normally be recommended. Okay. Anytime a weed gets treated with a lower rate, you lower that bar for selecting resistant biotypes. Okay. So if you lower that bar, a few more are going to get through than normally would. And we have to really start thinking about our rates in this way because we're letting some slip. And even though they might not be fully resistant, they're going to survive a little bit higher rate, right? And then their offspring are going to have a little bit more of an advantage going forward. Looking at Harness Extra, it's not just, some of these premixes of different products. Harness Extra, right? It's got atrazine in it, but when we look at the acetochlor, it's at a lower rate than just Harness alone as well, 2.32 pounds instead of 2.41. And then you look at Sure Start, right? 3 pints, that's a full rate on our fine soils, gives you 1.41 pounds active of acetochlor. Again, that's a full pound less than we would recommend of Harness on its own, of acetochlor on its own. So if we're putting out a pound less, that gives a lot of room for some of these water hemp to make it through. Again, they're not going to be probably resistant right away, but if they're surviving a little bit, they're going to have offspring that might survive more if we come back with these higher rates. This is kind of that creeping resistance I think we're seeing, especially these group 15 herbicides. So, to break this down a little bit more, again, Megan did a great job showing the label and then doing the math that we'll do here in a second. So you can see that Sure Start label, it's made up of acetochlor, flumetzolam, and clopyralid. You can see the different pounds of acid equivalent and how much it contains there, like it does on every label. The rate, you can see for our fine soils, max rate is 3 pints to the acre. So if we do some quick math, you got 3 pints per acre. You break that down to how many fluid ounces, it's 48 fluid ounces to the acre. So you take that and you look at your active ingredient, right? You knock out your fluid ounces, gives you 1.41 pounds of acetochlor. We need to be taking a little more time looking at our premixes, looking at what we're putting out in these fields, doing a little bit of math. I know we don't like doing math, right? But do a little bit of math and see how much are we actually putting out. And then look at how does that compare to our individual product recommendations as far as rate. And we want to make sure we're close. Like so we can use a Sure Start, but we might want to spike a pound of active ingredient acetochlor into that mix to raise that rate. Okay. We just want to be making sure we're managing these weeds the best way we can. So, soybeans specifically, what are we going to do? Start clean. I can't stress that enough. If those weeds come up with the crop and we don't have good control early, we see more escapes. Year in, year out, this is a challenge for us. Narrow up the rows if we can. If you're not already on narrower rows, and I'm not saying we all have to drill beans, we can narrow up to 15 or 20 inches. It helps close that canopy a little bit sooner, gives a little bit of competition to those weeds. And then once we shade those row middles, we have a little less emergence as well. Part of this starting clean and getting a good start for me is always using a pre-herbicide. This gets us ahead of the game, takes that selection pressure off of our post-herbicide as well. So looking at our soybean pre-emergence herbicides that we have available, and again, our focus is water hemp, right? We have a number of products that are good to excellent. I think a lot of folks are using Authority and Spartan type products. That's right there, excellent product, right? We have our group 15s next, the acetochlor, esmetolochlor, and peroxysulfone. They're all fair to good. they do a good job. As we move down through, you'll see a few that are ALS inhibitors, like First Rate, Pursuit, Python. Remember, we have about 100% resistance to the ALS inhibitors. We get a little bit of activity pre-emergence, but honestly, this is more of a target site resistance. So if it's resistant post, it's pretty much resistant pre as well. So we don't get a lot of utility. Again, they work well on a lot of other species. So I'm not saying don't use them, but if we're targeting water hemp, they shouldn't be the first thing in the tank. Now, you can also see Linux, Lorox there about the middle, and then Prowl and Treflan, the next line. They both are good to excellent. These are older products. They were used more frequently in the 70s and 80s, maybe even the early 90s. They still give good to excellent control. The yellow herbicides, the Prowl Treflan, definitely need that activation. But these are things we might want to consider and probably things I'll look at in research programs to see how they might fit and do we need to be bringing them back into the portfolio of what we're spraying. And then you can see Metribuzin and Valor down towards the bottom, both excellent, good to excellent control of water hemp. So we have a number of good pre-emergence options. I recommend putting two of them together for our water hemp control. It's often easiest to do a group 15, one of the acetochlor, metolachlor, dimethenamide, peroxysulfone, one of them, or one of the yellow herbicides, Prowl, Treflan, with either metribuzin, the sulfentrazone, or flumioxazin. Those are good combinations. You get a grass product with a broadleaf product. The grass products also give you control of your water hemp. Then we come back with our post as needed. We really need to be timely and we need to be looking at tank mixes, especially if we think we have resistance to some herbicides. We want to make sure we have two effective sites of action. Okay. So if you have glyphosate and ALS resistance, make sure you're using a PPO with your glufosinate or glufosinate 2,4-D, something where you have two effective herbicides in that mix. Now, post products, we've already seen this table, so I'm not going to belabor it, but just remember we do have a number of products that still give good to excellent control on most of our acres, especially 2,4-D and Liberty. But don't forget about those PPO inhibitors, Cobra, Blazer, Reflex, FlexStar, and Resource. Now, overlapping residuals. Okay. This is something we used very effectively in North Carolina, especially before we had Liberty Link, Enlist, or Extend soybeans. We would use residuals pre emergence and post emergence before Palmer amaranth ever emerged. Okay. So we would overlap these herbicides to try to keep those pigweeds, those weeds from coming up at all because we didn't have much besides PPO inhibitors post, and we're trying to protect those at all costs. So this is just a quick diagram that shows when we would time these, right? So we put our pre out obviously at planting, right? But before it runs out, and this is kind of arbitrary, I put it about V3. It might be V2. It's going to depend on the year and the weather, but we want to put that post residual out prior to seeing another flush of weeds come through. Now, is this something we need to do on every acre? Is this something we need to do everywhere? Everywhere? No, but this is another tactic that can help us keep water hemp from coming in and being as big of an issue as it might be if we're not getting ahead of it. So if we can lay down a good strong pre two modes of action at planting and come back with a group 15 or maybe even a PPO with residual activity in that post spray early enough, we can get overlapping control and keep that water hemp from coming up and having to spray it with our post herbicide early. And I say this stuff because when you look at water hemp, it has a long window of emergence and germination. Okay. So this graph just shows over time and with those growing degree days, right? So even as it gets warmer, as we go later into the season, the water hemp is still going to emerge even after other weeds have kind of stopped, right? Ragweed is an early emerger. It's going to come up, not be a problem later. So we could use a strong pre there and get 90% of the ragweed. Water hemp, we use a strong pre, we're going to get maybe 15 to 20%. We're still going to have 50% or more we have to control with our post emergence applications. If we put overlapping residuals out, we extend that window that we're taking out germinating water hemp and taking pressure off of our post herbicides. So I get ahead of myself sometimes, but basically, this sums up what I just said, right? We're taking that selection pressure off. We want to use our multiple sites of action to reduce selection pressure to really give longevity to our chemical weed control options and have an effective resistance management strategy for both corn and soybean. Overlapping residuals isn't just for soybean at all. Now, talking about corn, we're going to use some of the same principles, right? Again, starting clean, always use a pre herbicide, pre plant residual, use full rates, right? The examples I was giving were corn herbicides. We want to make sure we're using the full rates of the products in the standalone, and if they're premixes, we want to spike them if necessary. So we need to be taking a look at what falls a little short in that premix and add to it to make sure we're not letting some of these water hemp slip through. Now, looking at our pre-emergence options in corn for water hemp, there's a whole host of products that work good to excellent. Basically, anything we have listed is going to give good to excellent control if we use it at a full rate. The challenge is we take these individual products, we put them in premixes. Like I've already shown, we get a reduced rate where we probably reduce our effectiveness. But because we're in a combination, we get better control with them together. The question is, how much creeping are we getting over time? That's something we need to figure out and get a handle on. We want to use our post as needed. Again, tank mix where we have resistance and be timely. That timeliness is key. There's a lot of data that shows if those weeds get over 3 to 4 inches tall, we start seeing yield reductions, we start seeing impacts on our ability to control it as a whole. And again, looking at our post emergence herbicides, we have a whole host of good to excellent products. Most of the market in corn is targeted around our key weeds. And you can see, with the exception of Bassagran, really, on this list, everything is good or excellent for our control. And again, I'll mention the overlapping residuals just because it's a single slide. And if you just happen to look at it, I want to keep that in mind as a tool that we can use. So, overall, what are we doing? We're minimizing that seed bank by using multiple sites of action within our crop, starting with a good pre. We're going to use full rates. That includes our sequentials and our tank mixes. We want timely post applications. We're going to start clean. Those are all our chemical control tactics, right? This is how we're going to control them with our herbicides. But that last bullet there shows where we're heading in the future. Okay. We've got to take advantage of our non chemical cultural practices where they fit. Okay. Where can we narrow up our rows? Where can we change our planting date to shift that germination window? Can we fit in cover crops? Can we change our tillage? Are we going to use harvest weed seed control? There's a number of different tactics that are out there that are effective, but we got to figure out where they fit. And not every tactic is going to work on every acre. And we don't have to adopt every tactic across the whole farm. And looking at the outlook for this current year, yeah, I'm not saying plant cover crops across your whole farm, right? But what we need to start doing is thinking about where do these fit, right? Where can we put a narrow row, or where can we try cover crops? Where can we see what it takes to manage that to be effective? How's it going to fit in? How much more time does it take? How much more does it cost? Try it on a field here or a field there. Get a feel for it, because unless something really changes with these herbicides, chemical control, the days might be numbered, right? I don't want to be chicken little. The sky's not falling. We still have options, but we don't have new herbicides coming like we used to 30 years ago. So we need to implement these alternative non-chemical practices where we can, while we still have herbicides that work, so we don't have to make drastic changes in the future. So there's been research done around the country and even here in Iowa looking at different cover crops. This is research done by a student named Steve Dearden. He did his master's, finished in 2022, looking at cereal rye cover crop, when to plant, what you need to be successful, right? Can you plant green? Does that maximize water hemp suppression, right? Ultimately, what we need is around 5,000, I like 6,000 pounds of cereal rye biomass to give a good suppressive layer to our weeds in the spring. Okay. Now, if we do this, we can be successful in aiding weed control. It's not going to be the solution. It's not going to keep all water hemp and all weeds from ever coming up. But if we look at this graph here, we see that interaction and the impact it has. So the orange bars are where there's no cover crop. We just use prefix and Liberty early posts, prefix pre followed by Liberty or Liberty alone. That's no cover crop, right? We can see the density for the water hemp is 130 to 210 plants per square meter. Okay. So we didn't I mean, we clearly reduced it, but we didn't do a great job controlling it and keeping it from being an issue. By having that cover crop out there, we reduced in each of the categories by over 50% the number of water hemp that are out there. And so it takes, again, that selection pressure off of those post herbicides. It gives some security with our PPO, with our Liberty. Make sure that these are going to be viable options in the future. So the combination of a cover crop with our herbicide, the green bars, we see having that residual product is better than not, right? The first two bars have prefix, which is dual, and flex star or reflex. We get better suppression of water hemp, lower densities where we have that cover crop, especially compared to no cover crop, but even compared to just Liberty alone. Okay. So we want to be having multiple mechanisms of action. We have different herbicides, we have cover crop. We're combining and diversifying our weed management. This is what we need to be looking for down the road. Again, we're not just going to throw this together and everybody do it, but we need to try this on a few fields on our farms just to see how it fits and how we're going to manage it as we head that direction. So we're going to have more integrated weed management going forward, cover crops, row spacing. Can we change population? We've done some work in the past. I might even try it here in Iowa. We did it in North Carolina where we changed the population of our corn and our soybeans, increased where we traditionally had weeds. So we mapped the weeds over time, increased the population for the corn and soybeans where the weeds typically are, but reduce the populations in areas of the field that are typically cleaner. So we don't change our net seed costs, we just vary our planting population. That might be something we can utilize in the future. Again, that's some research that needs to be done. Can we vary our planting date? What about crop rotation? What are the impacts there? Using our herbicide mixtures, our overlapping residuals are going to be key to being successful. And then I added harvest weed seed control here. I don't have a lot on it. Um, I think there's a little bit of mixed success with it. The impact mills on the back of the combines, they're effective on reducing the viability of the seed that goes through that combine. but I think there's some challenges we have to work through on managing residue movement and flow through that combine and having it work in our high residue systems. So there's a little bit of tweaking there, but I think narrow uh, windrowing and chaff lining are things that can work. They're low cost, and it concentrates that weed seed in a little bit of a mulch layer about a foot wide in the field. Then we can target control. There's different things we can do there. So that might have a fit. I think that's something we still need to look at going forward. With that, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you for your time. My information is on the slide here. Uh, as you can see, I got another reason for being excited to be back home here in Iowa, get a chance to get out and enjoy the outdoors. But feel free to contact me with any of your questions, any concerns, and frankly, if you have a good research idea, I'm always open to that as well. Have a great day.